Very good. So thank you very much. Thank you very much all for joining us. And so this is the second panel that we are going to start right now. So I would like to welcome our audience, both in Singapore and globally, students, friends, and colleagues of SUTD. I'm Rafael Martinez, a research fellow at the Lee Kuan Yew Center of Innovative Cities at SUTD. And on behalf of my colleague Winston and the center, of course, I would like to thank you for joining us for the Reimagining the Urban in the Post-Pandemic Era workshop. So our next panel, this is the second, it says Nationalism, Economic Response and Measures. As I said, this is the second panel of day one sessions, focus on revising the connections, new relationships and interpretations between the state and citizen. Today, I'm deeply honored to introduce our panelists. First, we have Natharoun, who is the director of the Center for Khmer Studies in Cambodia, and Ika Fernandez, who is a spatial planner and development researcher, founding convener of Urbanismo PH in the Philippines. So I'm grateful to our panelists for taking time off of their busy schedule and to accept our invitation. Next, my colleague Winston will explain the modus operandi for this session. Winston?
Yeah, so this is the second session for the day, and we will proceed accordingly as similar as we have seen in the first session. So the first 30 to 35 minutes will be a roundtable dialogue led by the moderator, between the moderator and the panelists. And following that, we will be accepting questions from the audience. So you can submit your questions throughout the presentation, or you can also raise your hand and you will be given the opportunity to speak. So those are the ways that you can raise your questions. And also following from this, at the end of this presentation, this session will be recorded and it will be uploaded onto the website, the LKYCIC website. And so aside from that, for participants who would like to have a copy, they can email us directly and we will provide them with the video as well. Yeah, so that's also, without further ado, I shall pass the time on to Rafael to start off with the first question for the panelists.
Thank you very much, Winston. So let me give you some background before asking the questions or going to the questions. So as you know, the pandemic has triggered spatial and trade lockdowns. Many countries have soured their relationships with their neighbors, with some even burning bridges. At a national scale, nationalism manifests itself in socio-political dimensions. For example, recent news has highlighted the widening of existing social chasms led by accounts of structural racism towards foreigners, retrenchment, or hiring freezes. So the first question I would like to ask to Natharoun and Ika is, in the past year, have you witnessed examples of response measures that might reflect the hidden expressions of nationalism? And a follow-up question is, moving forward, what do you think are the implications of this movement on the global economy and global partnership? So just going back, have you witnessed examples of response measures that might reflect the hidden expressions of nationalism? And moving forward, as I said, what do you think are the implications of this movement on the global economy and global partnerships? Of course, from the point of view of your own countries, your own cities. Who would like to start? And perhaps Ika, Natharoun?
I'm comfortable either way, Ika. If you like to start, I'm happy, to
Ika?
have you go, or if not, I can start as well.
Sure. Please go ahead.
You prefer me to go, Ika?
Yeah, sure.
Okay, sounds good. So Thank you, Rafael, for the question. They are complex questions, actually, very complex, especially the second part related to the implication at the global level. But first of all, I would like to thank you and SUTD and Lee Kuan Yew University for the opportunity to speak on this panel. So before I start, maybe it's important just as a background setting to say that Cambodia compared to Singapore or compared to the Philippines is in a very different setting. And I think we will all agree that in terms of size of the economy, in terms of even pandemic development and the evolution of the pandemic, we had a very different kind of trajectories. So I want to emphasize first on the size of the economy, because I think this is very important to understand the economic situation of each country, which define the national response, so to speak, in terms of the pandemic, the partnership, and so on. So as you all know, or as a reminder for the one that doesn't, Cambodia accessed a few years ago to low middle income country status. So what it means is that Cambodia is experiencing growth that has been qualified as rapid, you know, a two-digit past decade, one digit recently, around 6-7%, and then dropped to, you know, to 1% during the pandemic, or a bit less. So it's important to understand that because of the, you know, the size of the economy and because of the size of the country, Cambodia is not, you know, one of the influencing economic power within the region, right? We are collaborating, we are having, you know, different partnership within the region. So now to answer the question whether we have witnessed like expression of hidden nationalism, I would say that it was not necessarily hidden in the sense that not hidden in the political sense. It was maybe hidden in the cultural sense, and I'm going to explain what I mean. Cambodians are not kind of, you know, frequently in the street demonstrating or expressing or voicing their concern on the public space. This is maybe a very Asian traits, right? So it's hidden in the sense that this hasn't been like making the front page of newspapers during many weeks. But we have seen, and I have witnessed maybe two different elements. One was some time of not necessarily resentment, but some time of distancing related to the expat community. And this was really in 2020. And maybe, sorry, I should have reminded as well the audience that at the beginning, I mean, Cambodia has been relatively well spared from the pandemic. We really had, if we look at the reported statistics, we had only a very few number of cases. Of course, like in other countries, we cannot say how accurate that is because monitoring capacities are limited, right? But if we take that as a standard, you know, that was monitored all through the world, it only, unfortunately for us, picked up very recently, like, you know, a few months ago. But before, the cases were imported cases, and the analysis showed that it was coming from the West, right? So again, I'm not going to comment whether this is accurate or not, but what it led to is kind of a, you know, social distancing or economic distancing, whereas in country, people would stop selling to foreigners, and again, more from the West, I'm saying, you know. So it would mean, you know, forbidding entry to, into shops to, some foreigners. But it's really like anecdotal. I haven't seen that. I haven't seen as well journals, newspapers, media reporting that on a large scale basis. It's really anecdotal, right? But if we want to see a form of nationalism, that could be one. And the second one that I need to mention is the one related to maybe the Chinese population. And when I say Chinese population, it's complex. I would say more Chinese recent immigrants, from China that came over the coming 2, 3, 4, 5 years in Cambodia. And so it's not, I would say, resentment, and I would use it with moderation. It's really not at the level of xenophobia. It's not, at the level of what you have seen in the West, which, is quite striking, right? It's like, what's happening in the US, which is very sad to see, but in other parts of the world as well, vis-a-vis Asian and Chinese. So here we saw that, but it was really, it had multiple dimensions. And sorry if I speak too much, but so this is the COVID-19 pandemic comes as a layer that superposes itself on top of other layers, right? So we cannot analyze only like the relationship between Cambodians and Chinese just looking at the pandemic. We have to go a bit back in the context of Cambodia, I'm speaking. So, for example, we have seen an increasing level of, Chinese migration through laborers that came and worked on, real estate construction sites, and that's one. There are other cases. And we have seen as well an increasing flow of Chinese tourists, that went on Siem Reap, one of the main tourist destination in Cambodia. And of course, it created resentment already from there. So we already like 5-10 years before the pandemic started. And this went, the root of that was not so much nationalistic expression, and it was more cultural divergence or differences, right? It's really more behavior. It's really more because, the language, the way Chinese and Cambodian would react differently or behave differently in certain situation. So this is kind of maybe the phenomenon, and it has been exacerbated by the recent events. But mainly as well, it was mainly rooted in behaviors. It was not Chinese or resentment or xenophobia, and it was really. So I give you an example that went into the local media, where Chinese were not so much complying with, wearing the mask and practicing social distancing, and and even respecting the curfew when it was enforced. And this was criticized both by the Cambodian government and the Chinese government as well, the local embassy. So, but those type of behavior, of course, create friction and tension. But it was really, I cannot say that it was large scale. I think it was really pocket of this that you could observe. And the government kind of reacted quite fast, saying, please don't put everybody in the same basket. And this is not, the response is not to kind of alienate and say, and point finger. So I'm going to stop there. Sorry, I talked too much, but this is the two examples that I've noticed. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, Natharoun. Very interesting. Ika, we would like to hear from you.
Okay, actually, Natharoun, I want to hear more, but
yes.
So how do we begin? It's a very difficult but important question you're asking, no? And before I can talk about the hidden aspects of nationalism in the pandemic, I think I have to speak a bit about the issues of nationalism in the Philippines, if that's okay. So in the previous session, Dr. Ona spoke a lot about the highly securitized and fraught pandemic response in the last year, and he spoke about populism, which speaks about how deeply divided the Philippine society is even before the pandemic. So the joke was the only things which brought us together before were Miss Universe contests and the fights of Manny Pacquiao before he became a senator and rather homophobic. So in terms of nationalism and Philippine nationhood, no, the Philippine government has the largest leverage, obviously, in shaping both foreign and local images of what the Philippines could be. But in the same way that right now there's no sense of what a post-pandemic city is, there's also a lot of anxiety in the Philippines about what a post-pandemic nation could be, especially because we're having elections next year in May 2022. So in terms of a functional framework of nationhood, whether hidden or otherwise, I draw upon Benedict Anderson's work on imagined communities, and in many ways, nationalism in the Philippines obscures the reality of us as an archipelagic space. We have 7,500 islands in the Philippines, more than 100 languages. But when you speak about nationalism, it's a construct which forcibly, unites the Philippines in one basket. But as spatial workers, we speak about multiple locations and temporalities. When people think about Philippine nationhood, they usually think about Manila, the Greater Manila area, which was the epicenter of the pandemic and which actually had a major fire in our major COVID hospital 3 days ago. Then again, you have other sites outside Metro Manila, which are also Philippine, but are not always integrated into the context of nationhood in the Philippines. And at the same time, 10% of Filipinos are migrant workers. And so you also have the Philippine nationhood for those who are outside our borders, including those who are frontliners abroad as hospital workers and nurses, but also those who are dealing with reopenings, as well as those who are working in ships which are still marooned in ports globally. So that's the kind of the fragmentation we're talking about, vis-a-vis the tendency of archipelagic thinking to be also very insular, almost baryotic, because we're so separate from the mainland Southeast Asia. Many people tend to think about reality in the world in a very closed way, and therefore only concerned about their family survival. So given that context, that shapes the way these hidden or not so hidden nationalisms are. And the most obvious way to frame it is the political relationships between our country, our state, and other countries, like what Natharoun was speaking about with China and the foreign. So it's a bit more complex than that. And I think the most immediate way it manifested was with the whole debate over travel bans. The Philippines, it was very hard hit, is still very, very hard hit, but the government refused to put travel bans, whether for migrant workers, but also for Chinese. Now, our first cases were from Chinese tourists. And so our relationship with China is very complex. We have a lot of Chinese Filipinos. I have some Chinese blood. But it's become a bit more difficult, especially with the ongoing tensions in the South China Sea, where you have Duterte's friendship with China, but also you have the influx of what you call POGOs, or the offshore online gaming. They're illegal in China, but they've all come to the Philippines, And at the same time, there are also intelligence reports of large numbers of PLA retirees who have settled in the Philippines. So you have that tensions, which is why when people were calling for travel bans early in the pandemic, we had all of these social media trolls, in our infodemic coming out en masse, where that's saying that calling for border measures was xenophobic, including this funny troll script, which spoke about the speaker speaks about being in a condo unit where you had a Chinese mainlander family crying in the elevator because they were supposedly being discriminated against, which obviously was a troll script in our disinformation ecosystem. But it's not just China. At the same time, you had a recent mid-level official saying that yes, the Philippines is bad right now in terms of COVID response, but at least we're not India, which pissed off a lot of people, obviously. So you have that external tensions, and so because you have that, no, a lot of the tension, the pressures is turned inward. The state is putting pressure on individual citizens, where the pressure is on individual Filipinos to protect themselves. So if a lot of the narrative is still individualized, that the pandemic is because Filipino citizens are not compliant with health standards. We're the only country which has shield requirements apart from mask requirements. So I'll stop in a bit, no. But so for me, given that context, nationalism has been forced to develop in ways outside the state context. Where, and I'll speak a bit more about this later, perhaps. But we see it in the rise of solidarity and mutual aid, because we can't rely on our state to support us. Like right now, the support we're getting is around $20 per person this year for indigents, which is crazy. No one can live on that. And so you have the rise of urban food gardens in urban poor communities. You have the rise of community pantries, around 300, almost 400 community pantries across the city, across the whole country, which where people are giving what they can, for those who are hungry. And the lines are long, which speaks about the kind of need people have. But of course, those who are running them are being called communists. At the same time, you have localization, where you have, because you can't rely on the national state, people are realizing that having a good village head or a good mayor spells the difference between life and death. And so you have civil society workers pushing for active mobility, because we closed down our public transport. People are now biking in a way that never was there before for survival. So that's something which I'm seeing now. Apart from as a, I guess, a counter to like the national context, which is a bit not working for us. You have alternate forms and narratives of pride and care, which I think is Filipino, but it doesn't necessarily need to be tied to the state. So that's my long answer, which I hope makes sense to you.
Totally.
Thank you very much. Yeah, and I find it so interesting that both in Cambodia and in the Philippines, it's driven a lot by context. And for example, in Cambodia, the case was about racial tensions, and like it's not really about the COVID bringing about breaking bonds in the sense. That's what I'm getting, but it's about these innate characteristics of society that happen to be highlighted because of COVID. And in the Philippines, there was also the case of how the spatial context is very important, how like different islands and different insular thinkings can shape the way that people interact and influence nationalism. So building on what was mentioned earlier, so earlier Natharoun mentioned that how the government has in a way tackled this is to adopt an approach that avoids alienating particular groups. And Ika also mentioned that civil society has stepped up to play a role for bridging this gap between nationalism and the national government's capacity. So I think this leads us to my next question, which is what can governments and civil societies do to mend broken ties or within society? Or at this point, after listening to you, do you think ties have been broken and do they need mending? Yeah, maybe first we can start with Ika for this round.
I think it's obvious that things have been fraught and broken long before, and those fissures were deepened by COVID, unfortunately. So, in terms of restoring the trust between the state and its people and the people with each other, we have a long way to go. So early on in the pandemic, just to share, the national government and local government had to issue anti-discrimination ordinances because people were discriminating against health workers, against foreign workers who were furloughed and had to go back. Some even throwing away. There were landlords forcibly evicting nurses for fear that they would spread COVID. No, so and even for example for foreign workers, there was a viral post about an overseas worker who had to come home, and their family had to set up a tarp outside their house saying, "This guy who came home is COVID free." Because of the intense, discrimination that was being experienced in these communities. No, so beyond these legal ordinances, you really have to find ways to bridge this gap, the gap between people, neighbors at that level, but also between the state and each other. Because with all of these misplaced priorities, I mean, people are going hungry, but our national budget is being put towards infrastructure and militarization, no? So being able to change that will be a major step. Uh, uh, right now, people don't know or feel that the state cares for them, and so the current feeling is that in Tagalog, kanya-kanya na to. Like basically, it's up to us citizens to make sure that our neighbors are alive and will survive this pandemic. So again, it's going to hurt. It's a traumatic experience. Now, let us not brush it away. The fact that we're speaking about a post-pandemic society does not mean it's going to happen or it's going to happen overnight. And so we think that in terms of the uh, I guess the effects because of the vaccination rollouts will probably end up leaving lockdown in 2023, but the trauma will stay on beyond that. The same way that people who go through war, who go through pandemics, in the past, have trauma they don't speak of. So I think there will be a need for a very deliberate and caring process, at the local level amongst communities, but also eventually at the state level. But it remains to be seen if we'll be able to do that. So let's check in maybe a couple of years' time.
Thank you. Natharoun?
Yes, thank you. So maybe in the case of Cambodia, and again, I re-emphasize on my point earlier that the pandemic is exacerbating existing tension or divide, if you want to call it like that, but not necessarily creating new ones. I mean, that's from the observation we have. So maybe if we want to speak about divide or gaps, two comes to mind. One is, the theme of the workshop today is focusing on urban. So we have that urban / rural divide or gap, that is increasing, and this is a much larger discussion in terms of what can be done to kind of reduce it, and what are the multiple possible strategies and response to this. But I emphasize that because if we look at the pandemic, we can see that the level of information and the level of impact is very different, whether you look at urbanized areas or whether you look at rural areas, right? So within urban areas and within rural areas, if we look at pocket of vulnerabilities, and I think this is a very important word, we talked a lot in Cambodia about poverty reduction and inequality reduction, and there has been a lot of progress made over the past 15 years. So the question comes now, how COVID-19 pandemic is going to impact the progress made over the past decade. So that's one question. We cannot answer it now because we don't have enough distance to analyze, but there are several institutions, including CKS, that are looking at this. In terms of the vulnerabilities, this is, I think, where the divide exists. This is a social divide. This is an economic divide between the one that can access services, the one that have a lot of coping mechanism in order to respond, in order to increase resilience of their family, of their communities around them, and the most vulnerable one that doesn't have that. And in the red, I mean the the categorization of the different zones, and that was based on the level of contamination and the level of cases emerging on a day-to-day basis. So it was red, orange, and yellow. The fact that all the red zones were located in urban areas, that was the first thing, and second, in neighborhoods where socio-economic classes were, among the lowest, if we want to look at it as a scale, was kind of revealing the nature of the issue and the divide. And that is why, when you ask, what government and civil society can do, well, those were the two major forces to respond to the issue, right? And I think the complexity is that I think the previous panel talked about, how do you rule, how do you govern when you're in a state of emergency, right? And what are the measures that apply that may sometimes impinge on individual freedom, but that are maybe necessary, right, to contain, temporarily necessary to contain like unfolding crisis. And that's why one of the questions that I have, I'd be happy to kind of discuss that as well with all of you, is to me, again, in the Cambodian context, beyond nationalism and economic response, that is the center of the panel. To us, it's really about, okay, how do we save lives? How do we cope with that pandemic? This is a health emergency situation, and there is not. I haven't observed, and I'm speaking in my personal capacity here, but I haven't observed any political capture, right? Direct political capture of the situation. I've observed that, most of the resources were really geared toward addressing that health, sanitary emergency, right? And therefore, for example, where border closure in other spaces, whether it is in Asia or in Europe or in the US, could have been seen or interpreted as xenophobic action or nationalistic action. In the case of Cambodia, I don't think that we would have had the choice not to close the border, right? And again, here, this impinge on health and scientific data, whether the pandemic is imported, whether, and from what country and everything. And we all lacked, at the global level, the right analysis, right? So the rapid response was closing border. And I don't know if I can express my personal view, but I would have done that as well if I was, a part of the government, I think. So so the attention that I think one of the complexity for all parties was how to manage, and maybe this has a traits with nationalism, somewhere, somehow, I don't know when it happens, but the whole management of that pandemic became kind of not a competition, but kind of okay, who is going to do best? Who is going to demonstrate the better capacity to contain, to respond, the measures in terms of quarantine, users of masks, curfew, vaccination rates, etc., etc. And when that started, and I don't know what it would be interesting to, I'm sure there has been research on this, but when this started, I think a certain bias went on all countries, and reporting was impacted by that. What would be the incentive of each of the, each nation to report accurate figures if they see a rapid pandemic spread, right? Keeping in mind that, there is a nationalistic importance of showing that we as country in Asia are able to, to manage and there is the dimension in Asia, but there is as well the dimension, the Asia versus the West. So anyway, a lot of papers have been written on this with more depth. I'm not going to go more into this. But this, in a way, have kind of made things more complicated. Because, of course, a collaboration. And if we look at, and I don't want to emphasize too much on this, but there is a political economy of the pandemic as well, right? So when you talk about collaboration between government and civil society, it happened and it has increased. But at the beginning, I think because of the unpredictability as well, you know, like for us, it was like all of a sudden, you know, oh, a London variant is there. And then indicators goes boom, 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 you know, almost exponential curve. And we were all, you know, from civil society, academias, a friend in the, you know, in the public authorities, in the international development agencies, everybody was watching and was wondering, you know, okay, what is going to happen? What's the future? So therefore, first step that we all saw was government response. Second step that we saw was really increasing collaboration with civil society. And I think the willingness is there, the importance of that collaboration, and not only with civil society, because you can see as well, I think 2-3 days ago, USAID like provided I think it was a package of $19 million US. I would need to check the figures again, but so, you know, a response from the research community. WHO was always there, working hand in hand with all the local authorities. So there is that multi-stakeholder approach is there, and maybe because as well of the transitioning status of the country, those type of multi-partners response, you know, to issues is something that the local authorities and the civil society and NGOs are used to. It's not something new, right? Yeah. So that's I don't want to continue more. Maybe I have other points, but I'll be happy to share them later.
Very good, Natharoun. I am curious to hear the reaction from Ika. So Ika, do you have any comment about, I mean, this is very rich what Natharoun has said. What would you like to say from the point of view of the Philippines?
These are things which need to be discussed in depth, definitely, and for a longer period of time. And I really think that there's much to learn among Southeast Asian countries. We don't, despite having a framework for the ASEAN, the kind of exchanges are not enough. No, so definitely we have much to learn from each other in terms of how, for example, people are able to adapt and respond to these changing times, whether it's from the governance perspective or from how local society actors are able to use mechanisms available to them productively. And even for the academe, no, most people, whether formal researchers or university students or teachers, aren't able to do classes. No? So the question is, how do you also now do engaged research in this time that is able to contribute to tangible outcomes for people who are still suffering under a pandemic? So there's a lot to unpack, and I think this is only a starting point, because you can't really go through all of these things in an hour, even if we tried.
Of course. Okay, so I think we can keep the time for the Q&A right now. I think it's a good time. So we would like to hear from the audience if someone has a question. This is a good time for you to do that. Do we have any question or any comments from the audience?
Maybe I can start first.
Sure.
Before rolling. Yeah. So the question that I have is, there has been a lot of emphasis on the nation and also internal pressures. I would like to focus a bit more on the external pressures. So do you think countries have an obligation to help their neighbors, and also what can they do to help their neighbors, especially like contiguous neighbors that are connected geographically? So maybe I can start with Natharoun first.
Yeah, thank you, Winston. So this is a complex question because it has some geopolitical implications. And I don't want to go on this pace because this is not my area of expertise, international relation and geopolitical dimension. Maybe I'm going to speak from what I know best, which is, the economic side and the interconnection with, society. So from what we've noticed, there has been a certain level of cooperation, right? Because, for example, I think that as Thailand and Laos and Vietnam were experiencing COVID, there has been talks. So I don't know if it happened at ASEAN level. I suspect it has, but there are a number of regional platforms where local authorities, so local governments, different ministries, as well as representatives from NGOs, local or international NGOs, talk to each other. So there is exchange of information, right, in terms of, okay, what could be done better, etc., etc., within the region, and as well even broader than that, right? One would simply need to look at what type of assistance has been provided in terms of human resource, in terms of capital, in terms of technical assistance, to kind of map out the type of solidarity, that occurred during this pandemic time. We haven't done that study. I haven't accessed it, so I wouldn't be able to look into the detail of that. But something that is sure as well, and something that I would understand, is it all depends also on existing capacities, right? And to what extent each of the countries, whether those are neighboring countries to Cambodia or even a bit out of Cambodia, has been impacted themselves by the pandemic, and their capacity, their internal capacity to respond to those, right? Lately, there has been a discussion within the WHO where they were saying that when there is a fire, you don't try to pack all the extinguishers and keep them for yourself. You try to spread those extinguishers because the fire is broad, and you need to address it with a global response or with a regional response. And I think, yes, certainly, and there is a context why the WHO is saying that. But in Asia, or in Southeast Asia, what I would say is that if a country is not able to respond and contain the pandemic within its own border, how would it has the capacity to go and help countries that are nearby, right? So that would be in terms of resources or donation, etc., etc. Now there is a second dimension which we haven't talked so much about, but it is economic nationalism. So in that sense, to what extent countries tend to close their border and prioritize their own people versus and disrupting supply chains, right? That would be regional, and that would have an impact. So let's say, I don't know, Cambodia used to export rice to Vietnam or China or other countries, and we had, in fact, temporarily as well, a measure where we stopped exporting for food security reasons, right? So, but it was temporary. I'm not sure how long that measure lasted. So the answer is really, it depends, right? So if you know that supply of rice is going to lack in Cambodia, therefore you need to stop export, well, okay, I guess it's a good short-term measure. And the question would be, okay, what about medium-term and long-term if the pandemic lasts, right? And those are complex questions. But in terms of economic nationalism, in the case of Cambodia, I haven't seen anything that we could think of, maybe, without being too, we could see, like maybe the negative part and the positive part of economic nationalism. And in my reading, they are more positive than negative for Cambodia, because economic nationalism translated mainly in supporting, you know, the local entrepreneurship ecosystem, investing in MSMEs, which represent more than 90% of the Cambodia's economy. Economic nationalism means in certain time, you know, protecting increasing your barriers to trade, right? So this is protectionism, right? But in the case of Cambodia, we haven't, to my knowledge, I don't think that the government or the Ministry of Commerce have, you know, increased taxes for imports or reduced quotas, etc., etc. I think we are so I think this is particular to Cambodia, but we have to be connected within regional value chains. And we have as well, more broadly, to look at trade agreements, right? And how those trade agreements may have been changed or you know, or interpreted differently within the pandemic time. That would be an interesting lens of analysis. But yeah, but I would say yeah, sorry. So I stop there. This is my contribution. Thank you.
Okay, maybe
Yeah.
Ika, before we also have a question from Marco, but Ika, I think it would be interesting to hear your opinion, and then we move to Marco, because Marco has a question. So, yes, Ika?
All right. So on the role that countries can play to support each other, you know. So we belong to archipelagic Southeast Asia, so we don't have the same value chain complexities that, you know, mainland Southeast Asia would. To be frank, no, building from what Sir Natharoun said, I wish we had more economic nationalism. And we saw that, for example, in our PPE industry. So while there's a small group of small manufacturers who tried to provide PPE early last year, you know, our government, in their infinite wisdom, preferred to import PPE. So these are things which I know have complex, you know, political and diplomatic reasons, you know, but the net effects for local communities are harsh. So in terms of positive, no, na measures, I like what Natharoun said about incentives. So, and I wish it's something that we could be able to build not only in ASEAN but globally, in terms of positive reinforcement of being able to build in the kinds of healthy competitions and support to learn from what countries like, you know, Taiwan, Vietnam, New Zealand, even Singapore was doing pretty well until this week. You know, what are the kinds of lessons learned from countries that have done well, and what could be applied in each other's context? No, so this is something which has not been, you know, done well, I think, and there are, again, complex diplomatic issues that at play, which I won't get into, no. But I keep on thinking about how Arunhati Roy said earlier in the pandemic that the pandemic is a portal, and many people thought about post-pandemic anything, cities, countries, as an opportunity for reform. But I feel, no, 1 year after that, we're reverting to the old ways. Vaccination distribution inequality globally is the most obvious form right now, and we're seeing it being used as a diplomatic tool by Western countries to induce other countries to do certain things, which I won't get into right now either. Nevertheless, we're very much interconnected, and until we're able to address this issue at a global level, we're all going to be stuck here for the next couple of years. So while you have the West opening up and going about their day, you have other countries and sub-regional areas, you know, lagging behind, at least 2 or 3 years behind. So the same way I said earlier that perhaps there is an opportunity for a nationalism beyond state level, perhaps it's also an opportunity for international solidarity beyond the nation state. So if the nation states have their own agendas, no, how can we now encourage citizen level sharing of knowledge? No, and I like the fact that you guys have been able to convene this conversation. It's a useful way to use Zoom, even if we're all tired of it by now. And what I like right now, what I've been observing is the way that food security activists, people who are able to now share their knowledge and experience across borders. I've been following what friends who are working in the urban poor solidarity community are doing, and you see, notes being exchanged from Asia and Latin America about very common struggles. So I really hope that once we're able to survive this, that we won't forget, and slip into the rush of forgetting a traumatic experience, but use this as a concrete platform for much needed change. So again, it's very nice to say, but hard to do. But maybe if we talk about it more and advocate for it, then maybe it's possible.
Very good. Thank you very much, Ika. Marco, we would like to hear your comments.
Oh, thank you, Rafael. I just want to use this wonderful opportunity to engage with Ika and Natharoun. My question is about how far your government, at the level of national government, play out the economic priority in handling the pandemics. Maybe perhaps a little bit of context to my question is that in Indonesia, it is very clear that the national government have been prioritizing economic development despite the pandemic to the level that actually they had been kind of manipulating our constitution in a way, because we have a law actually, and to the surprise of many, because before that we didn't know the contents of the health law, the law on our health, public health system that have been just issued a few years ago. The law said that in a pandemic or even other disasters emergency, the government should actually lock down. In Indonesian, it is very clear, it means lockdown, and that the government should pay for everything, including food for your pets. It says so, for pets and other things. And nobody knows about it before. And then it came out, and the government manipulated it by inventing new term, as if, I think it's called large-scale restriction instead of lockdown. They call it large-scale restriction. Later, we found out that actually the government did not have the capacity to fund the lockdown. So, but the priority on economy has been from very beginning. Our president's first comment is, "Oh, we are glad that China is locked down, so we can kind of grab the economic opportunity by opening up our touristic destination for people to come." It's crazy. But then also I would like to see it in the context of the dispute with local government, because obviously local government, do not have the power and therefore are not concerned with economic development. They are concerned with the welfare of their people. And the Jakarta government, because of its capacity, it is more able to challenge the national government. And because it has its fiscal capacity, it can also fund a lot of its own lockdown measure. So my question is, how does it play out in your country? How does your national government play out the economic priority vis-a-vis the health concerns? Because you see, the point is, I think because of their economic predetermined kind of priority, they have been politicizing the health issue into kind of support or non-support or popular support. Thank you. Sorry for taking time. I hope you have time to reply to me. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Marco. Who would like to start with a comment from Marco's idea? Perhaps Natharoun?
Yeah, I'm happy to go if Ika will. I don't want to go as the first. You okay, Ika, that I go? You can go as well. You sure?
Go for it. Yeah.
Okay. So I go then. Yeah, so it's an important question you're asking, Marco, and I think the best indicators was really lockdown situation, right? So one could say that, to put it very simply, governments that try to live to the maximum extent freedom of circulation of good, of trade, of people, were the one that were kind of prioritizing economic health toward the health system security, right, and the pandemic, because we had insight from different international science agencies telling governments that you need to control, right, movement rather than let it free. So this, with this indicator in mind, in the case of Cambodia, to my reading, the government has prioritized health before health while keeping in mind the economy. And it has really tried to, because this is, I mean, I wouldn't like to be in the public sector today, because I think that they're really facing, a conundrum. You have to solve catch-22 situation. You invest in the economy, your health risks go high. You invest in health protection, your economy goes down, right? So whatever you do, you lose. So, so in the case of Cambodia, it was really, to me, to my reading, priority was really health containment of the pandemic, as I said from the beginning, but then trying to think of, okay, sustainability of the economy, because while they were doing that, they were as well aware, the local government were aware of the severe impact that the lockdown had on especially the most vulnerable, right, the urban poor and in rural areas, but more for the urban poor, in fact, because in rural areas you could still access food, and there is another discussion, interesting discussion on this, social safety nets among local communities, etc., which you do not have at the same level in urban communities. And it leads me, and I'm going to be fast, to the second point, and one that is really, I think, important, which is the economic models that we are seeing today in Cambodia, but in Southeast Asia and in Asia. And it relates as well to the point before, related to cooperation, regional cooperation, right? So maybe one of the opportunity today is to use the pandemic as a way to rethink the way governments see economies, not as an end in itself. I don't think, and that's a strong belief I have, but economic system are to the service of social development, and therefore to the service of health services, right? And in the service of emergency response, such as this one. And maybe we need to rethink it, because we can see the drive of economic system being like the overarching system where GDP becomes the most important indicator. And it is an important indicator. I'm not saying that we should scrap GDP out, but we should think critically about the fact that GDP is not a perfect indicator. We should rethink as well about the meaning of economies. And for example, when we talk about agriculture, when we talk about tourism, when we talk about urban development and the whole technology and smart city agenda that is unfolding within Asia, what is the purpose of all this, right? We need to think about that. We need to think about purpose, and we need to do that pragmatically, because at the end of the day, it's important for each economy to create jobs. There is competitiveness as well, that we like it or not, among different countries. And therefore, I like the point of Ika that was saying she wished that there is more more economic nationalism. I believe that this is important to have economic nationalism, because we need to think about what are the sectors that can help us be more independent when crises happen, right? That help us to be more food independent, that help us to be more health independent, and that help our population to be better protected. But we should be doing that without disrupting all the cooperation that exists, you know, at institutional level, at regional level, at political level. As Ika said, you know, we are there is a long history shared among all of us in Asia. All I'm saying now is wishful thinking, but anchored in belief. You know, belief that we have to be pragmatic. You know, again, you know, there is economic competitiveness, but we need to think beyond that, because if we compete and we look at, you know, where I don't know, the Philippines and Indonesia and Thailand and Vietnam, where do we keep, you know, where do we try to retain the maximum value within our value chains, you know, to the detriment of others, is going to be very challenging. And there are possibilities. I mean, when I'm saying we need to rethink economic models, I'm not saying we need, you know, to scrap out the capitalistic system. Maybe it's a very imperfect one, but maybe this is one that is working the best so far. We need to regulate it. We need to tweak it a bit, but there are more sustainable ways ahead. Thank you.
Ika?
Okay, I think I'll answer both Marco's question and Professor Widyawati's question in one go because they're interconnected. And I was laughing while Marco was speaking because I've been following the pandemic in Indonesia, and we have, the Philippine and Indonesian cases are very, very similar. We're both archipelagic and we have very similar leaderships, unfortunately. So I guess to begin with, I think one of the lessons of the pandemic is that we cannot separate economic imperatives from health imperatives, and we see that in countries which have done pretty well with the response. Right now, New Zealand and others are opening up and have experienced growth, beyond what we're experiencing right now. So a good health policy is good economic policy. And it's something which, unfortunately, though, is something which many of our leaders, whether at the national or local level aren't always willing to acknowledge. So in terms of, their priorities, whether for economic growth and local support, like what Professor Widyawati is asking, you can see indications of that in the way governments structure their national budgets, and some friends of mine have been working on the analysis of budgets in the Philippines for the last 2 years under the pandemic. So unfortunately, for example, did you know in 2021, they slashed our health budget by several, from 181 billion last year to 131 billion this year. If you compare the budget for vaccines and the budget for anti-insurgency operations, the anti-insurgency budget is around just under 17 billion pesos. Our government allotted 2.5 billion for vaccines and are just allowing the private sector and COVAX to fill in the gap. So that tells you about the kind of priorities which they have. So basically, similar to Jakarta, and I guess in Indonesia in general, the fixation right now for this government is to focus on infrastructure and policing. With the thinking that infrastructure development, concrete, smart cities, these things, bridges, would generate trickle-down effects for growth, which is nice on paper, but impossible when people are hungry. And you compare that, for example, to zero support for MSMEs. And if you look at social protection packages, last year, the government ayuda support for indigent communities was around 8,000 pesos, around $160. This year, each individual received $20 per individual, a cap of around $83 per family. That is not enough to survive a pandemic. So in terms of being able to, the divides are staggering. The dichotomy between health policy and economic policy, the divide between macroeconomic imperatives and household economic imperatives is very stark. And in order to ensure that our neighbors survive this pandemic, will live to see next year, these are things which have to be rethought, to say the least. And so, which is why what I'm saying is that to have a pandemic-sensitive response, national response, they have to support the poor to begin with, because right now, it's not. So hopefully that answers both Marco and Professor Widiawaki's question.
Thank you very much, Ika. I think you did very well, and Natharoun as well. So on that note, we are going to finish. We are going to close this second panel. Thank you all for joining this panel, and a special thanks to Ika and Natharoun for your comments and ideas. We would like to invite you to the next panel. So the next panel is going to be at 2 p.m. Singapore time. So it's 1 p.m. in Jakarta. So the title is Health Awareness, a New Civic Duty. It's going to be led by Professors Ranjit and Alampai from the University of the Philippines. So thank you all again. Thank you very much, Ika and Natharoun, for your time. And we really appreciate your insights, and we look forward to continue this conversation. Thank you, of course, Winston, and see you all soon. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.